The 22-year-old CEO pulled his BMW into the circular driveway of his North Dallas mansion at 4:17 p.m. on a Thursday, jet-lagged from 5 days of back-to-back meetings in Houston. The Exxon deal had finally closed, adding another $40 million to the quarterly projections, but all he could think about was getting inside, checking on his father, and collapsing into his own bed. He'd been running Richardson Holdings since his 19th birthday, when a heart attack had forced his father into early retirement, and then the car accident 2 years later had changed everything again. He expected to find his father exactly where he'd left him the previous Sunday morning, propped in his wheelchair on the back patio, staring at the same patch of St. Augustine grass that had become his default focal point since the spinal cord injury. The neurologists at Presbyterian Hospital had been blunt about the prognosis: T12L1 incomplete lesion, permanent paralysis below the waist, significant loss of fine motor control in both hands. Functional independence is unlikely, Dr. Peterson had said during their last consultation. Focus on comfort and basic care. Instead, he heard something that made him freeze with his hand on the car door handle: guitar music. Not from the Sonos speakers he'd installed throughout the house, but live acoustic fingerpicking that sounded hesitant, yet deliberately paced. His father hadn't touched an instrument since college, and certainly not since the accident that had left his hands shaking too badly to hold a coffee cup steady. The insurance evaluation was scheduled for Monday morning, 72 hours away. Without documented progress in the quarterly review, $18,000 in monthly rehabilitation coverage would disappear, forcing a transition to basic custodial care that his father had begged him to avoid. "Don't let them warehouse me," had been his exact words during one of his clearer moments last month. He walked around the side of the Tudor-style house, past the rose garden his mother had planted before her own death 3 years earlier, following the sound of music. What he saw when he rounded the corner stopped him completely. His father sat upright in his wheelchair with a classical guitar balanced across his lap, fingers moving slowly but with unmistakable purpose across the strings. The melody was shaky and imperfect, but it was definitely "Fire and Rain" by James Taylor, a song he remembered his father humming during long car rides to their lake house in East Texas. His father's hands, which hadn't been able to manage basic tasks like buttoning shirts or using eating utensils for 2 years, were pressing fret positions and maintaining rhythm with a coordination that violated everything he'd been told about the permanence of his father's condition. The left hand was sliding between chord positions while the right hand picked individual strings in a pattern that required both strength and precision. Standing quietly near the French doors that led to the kitchen was the woman he'd hired 3 weeks earlier out of pure desperation. Denise Washington, 41 years old, had been his 7th attempt at finding someone capable of managing his father's complex care needs. 6 previous caregivers had either quit in frustration or been dismissed for various failures. Mrs. Chen had focused exclusively on hygiene and medication schedules, treating his father like an invalid rather than someone with rehabilitation potential. Mrs. Rodriguez had attempted aggressive physical therapy techniques that caused painful muscle spasms and set back his progress by weeks. The others had lasted even shorter periods, overwhelmed by his father's depression and the technical demands of caring for someone with a spinal cord injury. Unlike the previous caregivers, Denise wasn't watching his father play with detached professional interest. She was listening with the focused attention of someone tracking every note, every finger movement, as if each one represented measurable data points in an ongoing assessment. Her expression showed neither surprise nor excessive enthusiasm, just the steady concentration of someone monitoring a process she understood and had been guiding systematically. His father finished the song and looked up, noticing his son's presence for the first time. His eyes held something that had been absent for months: clarity and engagement rather than the hollow resignation that had become his default expression since the accident. Hey, kiddo, how was Houston? Did Exxon finally stop playing hardball with the contract terms? The young CEO struggled to process what he was witnessing. His father was not only playing guitar, but he was mentally present in a way that hadn't happened consistently since the injury. The cognitive fog that had characterized most of their interactions over the past 2 years seemed to have lifted significantly. "Dad, was all he managed to say. The question of how this transformation was possible stuck in his throat, tangled up with 2 years of medical opinions that had prepared him for gradual decline rather than improvement. Denise stepped forward with the kind of gentle authority that suggested she'd been anticipating this exact moment and had prepared for it. "Mr. Richardson, your son's back right on schedule. Why don't you show him what else we've been working on this week?" His father's smile was tentative but genuine. He adjusted his grip on the guitar neck, his fingers finding fret positions with more confidence than he'd shown for the simpler song. He began finger-picking the opening measures of Blackbird by the Beatles, a song he used to play during family gatherings before quarterly reports and board meetings had consumed his evenings, and long before the accident had taken away not just his mobility, but his belief that his hands could create anything beyond corporate signatures on documents. The young CEO had spent the past 2 years watching his father retreat into a depression so profound that most days he barely acknowledged visitors, including family members. Physical therapists from Baylor's Rehabilitation Center had worked with him for months, utilizing traditional exercises, occupational therapy protocols, and state-of-the-art equipment designed specifically for spinal cord injury patients. Each professional had filed reports documenting the same discouraging conclusion. Significant improvement in fine motor control was highly unlikely due to the nature and severity of the T12L1 incomplete spinal cord injury. The precise finger coordination necessary for complex manual tasks appeared to be permanently compromised. Yet here was his father, executing finger positions that required not only strength, but precise pressure calibration and timing coordination between both hands. His left hand was sliding smoothly between fret positions, while his right hand maintained steady, rhythmic patterns, demonstrating the kind of bimanual coordination that his occupational therapist had declared beyond realistic expectations just 4 months earlier. The medical impossibility of what he was witnessing sent his mind racing through everything he thought he understood about his father's condition and prognosis. He'd read the medical literature, consulted with specialists at Southwestern Medical Center, and had reluctantly accepted their conclusions about permanent limitations and the need to adjust expectations accordingly. "How long has he been able to do this?" he asked Denise quietly, trying to keep the conversation private while his father continued working through the Beatles song. "We started with very basic percussion exercises 11 days ago," she said, retrieving a thick composition notebook from a small table beside the patio chairs. The notebook was filled with detailed handwriting, charts, and what appeared to be systematic documentation spanning several weeks. Simple rhythm tapping using wooden spoons on different surfaces, just to assess whether we could activate the neural pathways between his brain and his hands. Day 3, he managed a consistent 4/4 beat for 2 full minutes without fatigue. Day 5, we introduced finger-strengthening exercises using a small keyboard. Day 7 was the first time he attempted to hold the guitar properly. Yesterday was his breakthrough day for actual chord changes and sustained playing. If this gave you hope today, subscribe. We're building a small corner of the internet for that. The young CEO flipped through her notebook, increasingly amazed by the meticulous documentation he was seeing. Every page contained timestamps, duration measurements for specific exercises, detailed notes about improvements or setbacks, and charts tracking various metrics he hadn't known were relevant to his father's condition. Finger strength measurements taken with a small device he didn't recognize, reaction time assessments using simple coordination tests. hand-eye coordination evaluations that showed steady improvement over the course of nearly 3 weeks. This level of systematic data collection and analysis was unlike anything he'd seen from any of the previous caregivers, most of whom had approached his father's care as a maintenance situation rather than an opportunity for measurable rehabilitation progress. "The other caregivers," he said, still processing the implications of what he was reading in her notes. "What exactly went wrong with their approaches?" Denise's expression remained diplomatically neutral, but her answer was specific and revealing. Mrs. Chen was genuinely caring and excellent with daily care routines, medication management, and ensuring your father's basic needs were met consistently, but she didn't have background or training in neurological rehabilitation techniques. Her approach was focused on keeping your father comfortable and stable, which was important for his overall health. But comfort maintenance isn't the same as actively working toward functional improvement. Mrs. Rodriguez brought more aggressive rehabilitation experience, but her background was primarily stroke patients, and she applied techniques that were inappropriate for spinal cord injury cases. The forced muscle movements she attempted actually triggered spasticity episodes that caused significant setbacks in his progress and increased his pain levels considerably. She paused, choosing her words carefully as his father continued playing in the background, now working through a simplified but recognizable version of Sweet Caroline that required more complex chord transitions. Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Kim both had good intentions, but they seemed to view this situation as long-term custodial care rather than rehabilitation with specific goals and measurable outcomes. They focused on entertainment and companionship, which has value, but they weren't trained to recognize opportunities for functional improvement or to implement systematic interventions that could capitalize on neuroplasticity. His father was still playing, and the young CEO began noticing details he'd missed during his initial shock at seeing the impossible sight of musical performance. His father's posture was significantly improved, shoulders straighter and head held higher than he'd seen in months. His breathing appeared more controlled and less labored. Even his coloring looked healthier, with less of the pallid complexion that had worried his physicians and prompted discussions about depression medication adjustments. "What made you think that music-based therapy would be effective for his specific type of injury?" he asked, genuinely curious about the reasoning behind an approach that none of the medical professionals had suggested or even mentioned as a possibility. Denise's answer was immediate and personal. "My mother lived with Parkinson's disease for 15 years before she passed away 2 years ago. Music therapy was one of the very few interventions that consistently provided measurable improvement in her motor function, even as other treatments became less effective over time. The rhythmic patterns created by music seem to activate neural pathways that can sometimes bypass damaged areas in the nervous system, creating alternative routes for motor signals." She gestured toward his father, who was now taking a break from playing but still holding the guitar in position, his hands resting on the strings with casual confidence that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. "During our first week working together, your father mentioned that he'd played guitar during his college years at SMU back in the 70s. That told me the procedural memories for this activity were still intact somewhere in his brain, locked away but not destroyed by the injury. Those kinds of deeply embedded motor memories can sometimes be reactivated even when other functions remain impaired. This wasn't theoretical knowledge from textbooks or certification programs, the young CEO realized. This was hard-earned, practical understanding gained through years of direct experience with neurological conditions and rehabilitation challenges. What he'd initially viewed as a desperate hiring decision made during a crisis period was beginning to look like possibly the first genuinely smart choice he'd made in 2 years of managing his father's complex care needs. His phone buzzed with a text message from his executive assistant. "Insurance evaluation confirmed for Monday, 10 a.m. Doctor, Martinez from the review board will be conducting the assessment. Rebecca mentioned he has a reputation for very strict interpretations of progress metrics and tends to recommend cost reductions when possible. The reality of their timeline crystallized sharply in his mind. The window for proving meaningful, measurable improvement was closing rapidly, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The insurance company had already questioned the extensive rehabilitation coverage twice during the past year, with their previous evaluator recommending a transition to basic custodial care rather than continuing the expensive specialized services. Without the $18,000 in monthly coverage that paid for equipment, medications, and professional care, his father's options would shrink dramatically to state-funded facilities that warehoused patients rather than providing active treatment aimed at improvement. Denise, this evaluation on Monday morning, do you think he'll be ready to demonstrate this level of improvement under that kind of pressure? She met his eyes with the steady confidence he was beginning to associate with her approach to challenging situations. That depends on what you mean by ready and what the evaluator is looking for. Can your father demonstrate measurable improvement in fine motor control, bilateral coordination, sustained attention, and functional task completion? Absolutely. Those improvements are documented, reproducible, and significant compared to his baseline assessments from 3 months ago. She paused, and her expression became more cautious. Will it be enough to satisfy an evaluator who may be looking for reasons to reduce coverage rather than reasons to continue it? That's much harder to predict. Some people are impressed by functional progress and quality of life improvements. Others are only convinced by very specific medical metrics that may not capture the full picture of what we've accomplished here. That evening, he decided to observe an entire therapy session from beginning to end, wanting to understand exactly what methods Denise was using to achieve results that had eluded trained medical professionals. What he witnessed was unlike anything he'd expected, based on his experience with traditional physical therapy approaches. Denise arrived at exactly 1:45 p.m., 15 minutes before what she'd identified through systematic observation as his father's optimal performance window. She spent the preparation time reviewing detailed notes from the previous day's session and arranging equipment in a specific sequence that seemed designed to minimize his father's decision-making fatigue and maximize his focus on the actual therapeutic activities. We're going to start with gross motor movements today and work systematically toward fine motor control, she explained to his father, who was already showing signs of increased alertness and engagement as the session began. Remember, the goal isn't to achieve perfect performance. The goal is to activate as many neural pathways as possible while keeping your stress response low enough that your nervous system can actually learn and adapt. She began with what appeared to be simple clapping exercises, but he quickly realized that each movement pattern was specifically designed to challenge different aspects of coordination and timing. Hands moving in alternating rhythms, arms crossing mid-line to activate both brain hemispheres, finger-pointing exercises that required visual tracking and hand-eye coordination. Each task built logically on the previous one, creating a systematic progression that pushed his father's current limits without overwhelming his capacity to respond successfully. The session continued with increasingly complex activities. Rhythm work using wooden spoons on different surfaces around the patio, each material requiring different pressure and wrist positioning. Ceramic planters produced sharp, precise sounds that demanded controlled movements. Metal table edges created resonant tones that required sustained pressure. Wooden deck railings generated warmer sounds that called for more dynamic striking techniques. The neuroplasticity research shows that musical training activates multiple brain regions simultaneously, Denise explained as his father worked through the exercises with obvious concentration and increasing confidence. motor cortex for movement planning and execution, auditory processing centers for sound recognition and timing, memory regions for pattern storage and recall, and emotional regulation areas that help maintain motivation and reduce anxiety. She moved him next to finger exercises on a compact electronic keyboard, starting with single-note sequences and progressing methodically to simple, two-handed coordination tasks. For someone with an incomplete spinal cord injury, that kind of comprehensive neural activation can sometimes wake up pathways that have been dormant rather than destroyed. The key is finding each person's optimal time window when their nervous system is most receptive to new learning. "Lee, how did you identify his best performance time?" the young CEO asked, fascinated by the systematic approach she was describing. "Trial and error over 2 weeks of careful observation," Denise replied. "I tracked his fine motor performance, attention span, energy levels, and emotional state at different times throughout the day." Most people assume that consistency in rehabilitation means doing the same activities at the same time every day. But real consistency means adapting your approach to work with each person's natural physiological and neurological rhythms. She showed him a detailed chart in her notebook that tracked his father's performance metrics across different times of day. "Your father's motor function is consistently strongest between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. When his morning pain medications have reached peak effectiveness, his cortisol levels from overnight stress are at their lowest point, and his energy hasn't been depleted by fatigue from earlier activities. We do our most intensive rehabilitation work during that window, and we use evening sessions for lighter maintenance exercises that reinforce what we've practiced." By the time they progressed to actual guitar playing, his father's movements had visibly loosened and become more fluid. He wasn't simply going through memorized motions. He was beginning to feel the music and respond to it emotionally as well as technically. His version of "Imagine" by John Lennon was still somewhat hesitant and imprecise, but it was clearly recognizable, genuinely musical, and performed with obvious intentionality and satisfaction. The breakthrough moment came during the second week of sessions, when his father managed to play an entire verse and chorus of "House of the Rising Sun" without stopping to rest his hands or adjust his grip on the guitar neck. His finger positioning wasn't perfect, and his timing still fluctuated slightly, but the coordination between both hands was unmistakably present and sustained. More importantly, his facial expression throughout the performance showed genuine enjoyment rather than the grim determination that had characterized his earlier rehabilitation efforts. "That's the best I've felt in 2 years," his father said after completing the song, his voice carrying enthusiasm that had been absent since before the accident. "It's like my hands remembered something my brain had completely forgotten was possible." Denise made a precise note in her composition book. Day 18, sustained bimanual coordination maintained for 3 minutes 45 seconds without rest breaks. Minimal reported fatigue. Patient spontaneously requested additional song practice. But 3 days before the crucial insurance evaluation, everything nearly collapsed. His father woke up Saturday morning with severe anxiety about the upcoming assessment, and the stress response triggered hand tremors that made guitar playing nearly impossible. During their scheduled afternoon session, he couldn't manage even the simple chord positions that had become routine and reliable over the previous week. "I can't do this," his father said in frustration, setting the guitar aside after 10 minutes of unsuccessful attempts that only seemed to increase his anxiety levels. "What if I completely freeze up during the evaluation? What if all this progress isn't actually real and I've just been fooling myself?" The young CEO felt his own panic beginning to rise as he watched his father's confidence crumble. They had scheduled the insurance evaluation based on 3 weeks of consistent progress reports and documented improvement, but now that confidence felt naive and premature. What if the stress of being formally judged and evaluated would undo weeks of careful work? What if his father's anxiety triggered a regression that left him worse off than before they'd started? Denise remained remarkably calm in the face of this crisis, which helped stabilize both father and son. "This is completely normal," she told them both, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had navigated similar setbacks before. Performance anxiety affects motor function in everyone, but especially in people who are already dealing with neurological challenges. The good news is that we've built up enough muscle memory and neural pathway development that this regression is temporary. We just need to adjust our approach for the next few days. Instead of pushing ahead with their regular exercise routine, which would have increased frustration and anxiety, she switched to what she called anxiety-compatible therapeutic activities. Gentle hand and finger massage using lavender essential oil to reduce muscle tension and promote relaxation. Breathing exercises synchronized with simple rhythm tapping that didn't require precise coordination. Guided imagery sessions where his father visualized successful playing experiences rather than attempting actual physical practice that might reinforce feelings of failure. The evaluation on Monday isn't about playing perfectly or impressing anyone with virtuoso performance, she reminded him patiently. It's about demonstrating measurable, documented improvement in specific functional metrics: reaction time, fine motor coordination, sustained attention span, and ability to complete goal-directed tasks. We have baseline measurements from your initial assessments 3 months ago, and we have current performance data that clearly shows significant progress across all of those categories. Dr. Martinez from the Insurance Review Board arrived Monday morning at exactly 10 a.m., carrying a clipboard filled with standardized assessment forms and projecting the skeptical demeanor of someone who had evaluated too many exaggerated progress claims over the years. He made it clear from his first comments that he would not be influenced by subjective improvements, emotional appeals, or anything that couldn't be measured and quantified according to established medical criteria. "I understand the patient has been participating in some form of music-based therapy," he said, reviewing the case file with obvious doubt about unconventional treatment approaches. "I'll need to see concrete, objective evidence of functional improvement that justifies continued rehabilitation coverage at this level of expense." Denise had clearly prepared for exactly this type of rigorous scrutiny. She presented Dr. Martinez with 3 weeks of systematically collected data, reaction time measurements taken with standardized instruments, fine motor coordination assessments using established occupational therapy protocols, duration records for sustained activity performance, and video recordings that demonstrated progression from initial baseline attempts to current performance levels. "We'll begin with baseline measurements using your standardized assessment tools," she said professionally. "Then I'll demonstrate the functional improvements we've achieved using the patient's preferred therapeutic activity, which happens to be guitar-based motor skill development." His father's hands were visibly shaking as Dr. Martinez administered the standard fine motor control tests that would determine his continued eligibility for coverage. Picking up small objects and placing them in designated containers, inserting pegs into holes with specific time requirements, tracing geometric shapes with a stylus while maintaining accuracy standards. The tremor caused by his evaluation anxiety made his performance inconsistent and clearly below the levels they'd achieved during practice sessions, and the young CEO watched Dr. Martinez making notes that appeared distinctly unimpressed and potentially negative. Then Denise brought out the guitar, and everything changed. "Mr. Richardson, let's start with the warm-up routine we've been practicing for the past 2 weeks. His father's entire demeanor shifted as he focused on the familiar instrument. The tremor in his hands began to settle as he ran through the finger exercises that had become automatic through daily repetition. Simple scales that activated individual finger movements, basic chord progressions that required coordination between both hands, rhythm patterns that had been practiced until they became neurologically embedded responses rather than conscious efforts. By the time he transitioned into playing Fire and Rain, the transformation was obvious and dramatic. His hands moved with increasing confidence and precision. His posture straightened noticeably, and his breathing became controlled and natural rather than anxious and shallow. This wasn't a disabled patient struggling with overwhelming limitations. This was a musician rediscovering his connection to an instrument and to his own capabilities. Dr. Martinez stopped writing notes and started watching intently. His father played continuously for 15 minutes, moving through songs with increasing technical complexity and emotional engagement. Fire and Rain, with its moderate chord changes and steady rhythm. Blackbird, with its more challenging finger-picking patterns. Sweet Caroline, with its dynamic shifts and sustained chord progressions. Imagine, with its delicate touch requirements. And finally, a simplified but clearly recognizable version of classical gas that demanded rapid finger movements, precise timing, and sustained coordination between both hands simultaneously. When he finished the final song, his hands were completely steady, his color was healthy and vibrant, and he looked directly at Dr. Martinez with quiet pride and confidence that seemed to surprise all three adults in the room. The current neurological literature strongly supports music-based interventions for incomplete spinal cord injuries, Denise said, handing Dr. Martinez a carefully organized folder containing research articles, case studies, and clinical data she had compiled specifically for this evaluation. The patient's documented improvement in fine motor control, sustained attention capacity, bilateral coordination, and functional task completion represents significant progress that directly impacts his quality of life, his independence in daily activities, and his overall rehabilitation trajectory. Dr. Martinez spent several minutes reviewing his assessment notes, comparing the results from the standardized clinical tests with the guitar performance he had just witnessed. The contrast between the two sets of data was striking enough that he asked his father to repeat several of the manual dexterity tests that had been problematic earlier in the session. This time, without the initial anxiety of being evaluated by a stranger, his performance on the standardized measures was markedly better and much more consistent with the functional abilities he had demonstrated through music. "I have to admit," Dr. Martinez said slowly, clearly surprised by what he had observed, "this represents some of the most compelling rehabilitation progress I've documented in cases of this type and severity. The functional improvement is not only well documented, but obviously sustainable and applicable to real-world daily living activities." And the formal approval for continued rehabilitation coverage arrived the following Wednesday, along with a request from the insurance company's medical director for Denise to document her therapeutic methods in a formal treatment protocol that could be evaluated for potential broader implementation with other spinal cord injury patients in their system. Tell me in the comments what you would have done differently here. I actually read them. 2 months after that first afternoon, when he'd heard impossible guitar music coming from his backyard, his father was playing for 45 minutes to an hour at a time and had regained sufficient fine motor control to handle most routine daily activities independently. He could button his own shirts, use standard eating utensils without adaptive equipment, write legibly with a regular pen, and manage most aspects of his personal care without constant assistance. More importantly, the severe depression that had dominated his personality and daily experience since the accident had lifted substantially. He had started attending a weekly music therapy group at Presbyterian Hospital, where he worked with other neurological patients, and had even begun serving as an informal mentor for newly injured spinal cord patients who were struggling with similar challenges. The young CEO found himself applying many of the same principles he'd observed in his father's rehabilitation to his own business management practices. Instead of imposing uniform schedules and standardized approaches across all departments, he began paying attention to individual optimization patterns and peak performance times for different team members. Rather than dismissing expertise that didn't come with traditional credentials, he started recognizing and utilizing practical knowledge and problem-solving abilities regardless of their source. Most importantly, he learned that sustainable improvement in any system required working with existing strengths and natural rhythms rather than trying to force change through sheer willpower or external pressure. The transformation in his approach to leadership became evident during a quarterly review meeting when one of his department heads was struggling with consistently missing project deadlines. Instead of implementing punitive measures or demanding longer hours, he worked with the manager to identify her peak productivity periods and restructured her responsibilities to align with her natural energy patterns. The result was a 30% improvement in project completion rates within 6 weeks. 6 months after that first day of hearing guitar music in his driveway, he was sitting in the executive conference room of Richardson Holdings, presenting a comprehensive proposal to his company's board of directors. The employee wellness program he was proposing would expand beyond traditional health benefits to include individualized care assessments and support services for family members dealing with chronic medical conditions, disabilities, or age-related care needs. Denise had agreed to serve as a consultant for the program design, helping to train other caregivers and healthcare coordinators in the systematic, data-driven approach that had proven so successful with his father's rehabilitation. The program would also establish partnerships with local rehabilitation centers, music therapy programs, and specialized care providers to create a network of resources that employees could access when facing family care challenges. The return on investment isn't measured only in reduced healthcare costs or decreased absenteeism, he explained to the board members, many of whom had initially been skeptical about the program's business justification. It's about recognizing that our employees are significantly more productive, creative, and engaged when they're not constantly worried about family members who aren't receiving adequate or appropriate care. He presented data showing that employees dealing with family care stress used an average of 12 more sick days per year, had 30% higher turnover rates, and showed measurably decreased performance on creativity and problem-solving tasks. The proposed program was projected to reduce these impacts while also improving employee loyalty and recruitment advantages in an increasingly competitive market for skilled professionals. The program was approved unanimously, with implementations scheduled to begin across 3 company divisions by the end of the fiscal year. The pilot program would eventually expand to cover all employees and would serve as a model for other companies in their industry sector. His father's recovery continued to progress, though it was never linear and certainly not complete. Spinal cord injuries don't disappear, regardless of how effective the rehabilitation approach, and there were still difficult days when pain, fatigue, and frustration limited what he could accomplish both physically and emotionally. Some mornings, he woke up with hand stiffness that made guitar playing impossible. Some afternoons, his energy levels were too low for sustained practice sessions. Some evenings, his mood was affected by the reality of permanent limitations that no amount of improvement could completely overcome. But he had regained enough function, confidence, and sense of purpose to live with dignity and engagement rather than merely surviving with professional assistance. He had re-established connections with old friends who had gradually drifted away during the darkest period following his accident. He had developed new friendships with other patients and families he'd met through the hospital music therapy program. Most importantly, he had rediscovered aspects of his own identity that existed independently of his physical limitations or his role as a care recipient. The guitar playing had become a central part of his daily routine, but it had also opened doors to other activities and interests that had been dormant for years. He started reading again, first music-related books and magazines, then branching out to topics that had interested him before the accident. He began following sports more actively, not just as passive entertainment, but as someone who could engage knowledgeably in conversations about strategy and performance. He even started expressing interest in visiting the company offices occasionally, not to resume any kind of work responsibilities, but to maintain connections with the business world that had been such an important part of his identity. On Sunday evenings, the young CEO often joined his father for informal music sessions on the back patio where this entire transformation had begun. His own guitar playing was admittedly amateur and inconsistent, limited by the time constraints of running a major corporation, but his father seemed to enjoy the shared activity regardless of technical proficiency. They would work their way through songs from the 70s and 80s, music that bridged the gap between his father's college years and his son's childhood, memories of family gatherings before business demands had consumed their evenings. During one of these Sunday sessions, his father paused between songs and looked directly at him with the kind of clear, focused attention that had become more frequent as his overall condition improved. "You know what I learned from this whole experience?" "What's that, Dad?" "Competence isn't always found where you expect to find it. Sometimes the person who knows exactly what you need is standing right there, waiting for someone to notice what they're actually capable of accomplishing." He adjusted his grip on the guitar and began finger-picking the opening measures of "The Water is Wide," a traditional song they'd never attempted before, but one that seemed appropriate for the moment. "The hardest part about getting better wasn't relearning how to use my hands. It was learning how to recognize expertise that didn't come with the credentials I was used to respecting." The guitar music continued long after sunset, drifting across the Highland Park neighborhood like a quiet reminder that recovery comes in many different forms, and that sometimes the most profound changes happen not through dramatic intervention or expensive medical procedures, but through patient, skillful, systematic attention to what's actually possible when someone truly understands both the problem and the person who needs help solving it. As the evening wound down and they put away the guitars, the young CEO reflected on how much had changed in his understanding of leadership, caregiving, and human potential. The business lessons had been valuable, but the personal ones had been transformative. He had learned to look for competence in unexpected places, to value systematic patience over quick fixes, and to understand that sometimes the most important investments are the ones that can't be easily quantified on quarterly reports. The insurance company had eventually asked Denise to present her methods at a regional conference on innovative rehabilitation approaches. 3 other companies had implemented similar family care support programs based on the Richardson Holdings model. His father's neurologist had started referring other spinal cord injury patients to music-based therapy programs, acknowledging that traditional medical approaches didn't always capture the full range of therapeutic possibilities. But perhaps most importantly, they had all learned that recovery is rarely about returning to previous states of being. Instead, it's about discovering new possibilities within current realities and recognizing that human resilience and adaptability often exceed the limitations that medical textbooks and insurance evaluations are designed to measure.